The Sunday night Eudora Callahan first carried her lantern to the graveyard. The wind came off the prairie like something alive and grieving, and she did not once look back at the house that had stopped feeling like home the moment they buried Thomas Callahan in the hard November ground. It was the autumn of 1878, and the town of Harlow Creek, Texas, had already begun the slow, practiced business of forgetting its dead. That was simply the way of things on the frontier. Men died young, of fever or drought or the particular cruelty of a drought-stricken herd that left a family with nothing. Women buried them and found ways to keep breathing. The land demanded it. The children demanded it. The relentless, indifferent Texas sky demanded it, wide and cloudless and utterly unmoved by the small human tragedies unfolding beneath it. Eudora was 32 years old when Thomas died of a fever that took him in 4 days. She had 2 children, a son named Henry who was 9 and already had his father's serious brown eyes, and a daughter named Clara who was 6 and had inherited Eudora's own dark auburn hair. She also had a modest house on the eastern edge of town, a vegetable garden that she tended with the careful precision of someone who understood that the garden was not optional, a milk cow named Bessie who was temperamental in the mornings, and a debt to the Harlow Creek savings and trust that was not yet crushing, but that required her complete and sustained attention. Thomas had been a good man. Not a remarkable man, not a man whose name would echo down through the years in the way some men's names did, but a quietly decent man who had loved her in the steady, undemonstrative way of men who grew up in places where feelings were considered a kind of unnecessary luggage. He had worked the farm diligently. He had never raised his voice to her. He had come to her bed on cold nights and wrapped his arms around her and breathed warmth into her hair, and she had been content. She had not understood until he was gone how much of herself had been organized around the simple fact of his presence. Not his passion, not his brilliance, but his presence. The particular weight of him in the chair by the fire, the sound of his boots on the porch steps at dusk. The way he said her name, Eudora, with a slight emphasis on the first syllable, as though the name itself pleased him. When that presence was removed, the house became a series of rooms that echoed. She started visiting the graveyard on the Sunday after the funeral because she needed somewhere to put her grief. It seemed indecent to leave it loose in the house where the children could see it. Henry was already too watchful, too carefully composed for a 9-year-old boy, and Clara cried herself to sleep with a stoic, heartbreaking quietness that made Eudora want to press her fists against her own chest to keep something from escaping. So she waited until the children were asleep, and she lit the lantern on the kitchen table, and she walked the half-mile to the graveyard at the edge of town, where Thomas lay beneath a wooden marker that she intended, eventually, to replace with a proper stone. She sat beside his grave for an hour that first Sunday, not speaking, just letting the grief have its space in the open air under the enormous Texas sky. The lantern sat beside her, casting its circle of amber light across the dry grass, and she did not feel better exactly, but she felt less as though she might shatter. She went back the next Sunday, and the Sunday after that. By winter, it had become something she did not question. A ritual, a small, private ceremony of remembrance that asked nothing of her except that she show up and carry the light. What Eudora did not know, could not have known, was that a man named David Bailey had seen her light from the upper pasture of his ranch on the very first Sunday she had walked to the graveyard, and that he had been seeing it every Sunday since. David Bailey was 36 years old, and he had been running the Bailey Ranch for 12 years, having taken it over from his father at 24 when the old man's arthritis had finally made it impossible for him to work the land. The ranch sat on a modest spread of 240 acres about a mile north of Harlow Creek, close enough to the edge of town that on clear nights the lights of the settlement were visible from his upper pasture, which was where he tended to go on Sunday evenings when the week's labor had sufficiently settled his body, and the quiet of the open land had a chance to settle his mind. He was not a man who was easily described in simple terms. His cowhands, of whom there were 3 year-round and 2 more during calving season, would have said he was fair and demanding, and that he did not ask anything of them he was not willing to do himself. The people in town would have said he was reliable and slightly reserved. The women of Harlow Creek, several of whom had made their interest in him known in the particular indirect but unmistakable way that the social conventions of 1878 permitted, would have said he was handsome in a sun-worn, weathered way, with dark eyes and hands that bore the honest marks of hard outdoor work, and that he was unfortunately difficult to draw into conversation about anything other than cattle prices and weather. The truth was that David Bailey was a man who had spent so long learning to carry himself with competence and self-sufficiency that he had somewhere along the way misplaced the instinct for simply wanting things for himself. He ran the ranch well. He was on good terms with his neighbors. He kept his accounts in order and his fences mended and his word reliable. He went to church on most Sundays. He ate his supper alone at a table that could have seated 8 people, and he did not, most of the time, allow himself to think too much about the fact that the silence in his house was something different from the restful quiet he felt in the open pasture. The first Sunday he saw the light, he had been leaning against the fence post at the top of the upper pasture, looking south toward town, not thinking of anything in particular. It was nearly 10 o'clock, and the town's lights had mostly gone dark as people settled in for the night. And then, moving at a steady, unhurried pace from the direction of the residential streets toward the low rise where the graveyard sat, he saw a small amber light swaying gently in someone's hand. He watched it reach the graveyard. He watched it settle and become still. And then he watched it remain there, a small, steady flame in the darkness, for close to an hour, until it began its return journey back into the town. He did not know what had moved him about it. There was nothing objectively remarkable about a person carrying a lantern on a Sunday night. Plenty of ordinary explanations existed. But something about the quality of the light, its steadiness and its solitude, the particular way it sat motionless in the graveyard as though keeping watch over something that mattered deeply, caught at something in him that he could not name precisely and did not try to. The next Sunday he was in the upper pasture again, and the light came again, and he found himself waiting for it without having consciously decided to wait for it. By the 4th Sunday it was simply something he did. He went to the upper pasture on Sunday evenings, and sometime between 9:30 and 10 o'clock the light would appear, make its way south to the graveyard, sit for its hour and return. And David would watch it, and something in him that was usually clenched and functional would, for that hour, relax slightly, the way a fist unclenches without quite becoming an open hand. He asked around town carefully, quietly, over the following weeks. It was not difficult to piece together. Thomas Callahan had died in November of a sudden fever, left behind a widow and 2 young children. The widow was Eudora Callahan, lived on the eastern side of town, kept a vegetable garden and a milk cow, was considered quietly capable by everyone who knew her, and was said to be in decent spirits, all things considered. That was the word people used, decent spirits. As though grief were a kind of weather that well-mannered people navigated, without causing too much disruption to those around them. David thought about the light in the graveyard and what it meant to carry a lantern to the same place every Sunday night for months and months, and he thought that, whatever decent spirits meant, it was probably more complicated than the phrase suggested. He wanted to speak to her. The wanting came on gradually, the way most real wants do, not as a sudden impulse but as a slow accumulation of smaller moments and thoughts, until it was simply there, undeniable, a persistent presence in the back of his mind. But he did not speak to her that autumn. He told himself it was not the right time, that she was grieving, that a woman who had lost her husband 4 months ago did not need a near stranger from the north edge of town presenting himself to her. He told himself he was being respectful. By spring, he was still watching the light every Sunday, and still telling himself things were not the right time, and was beginning to be honest enough with himself to recognize that respectful and afraid were not always entirely different from each other. It was a Sunday in late April 1879, and the prairie had shaken off the last of the winter cold and was doing the extravagant, short-lived thing it did every spring, throwing up wildflowers between the grass stems and filling the air with the smell of new growth, when David Bailey finally stopped waiting for the right time and simply acted. He had saddled his horse, an even-tempered buckskin named Roscoe, and ridden down from the ranch toward the graveyard, not toward town. He was not going to ambush her at the mercantile or engineer a social encounter at the church. He was going to the graveyard because that was where she went, and because that was the only honest approach he could think of. He arrived before her and tied Roscoe to a scrub oak well back from the graveyards, edge so the horse would not startle her. He stood a respectful distance from the gate, close enough to be visible in the ambient moonlight but not so close as to block her path. And then he waited. He heard her before he saw her, the faint sound of grass under careful footsteps, and then the amber glow of the lantern came over the low rise and preceded her by a few yards, and he saw her for the first time at close distance and realized that the careful, second-hand description the townspeople had given him had entirely failed to prepare him for the reality of her. She was tall for a woman of her time, with a straight, self-possessed bearing that spoke of someone who had learned to take up her full measure of space in the world without apology. Her dark auburn hair was pinned up under a simple bonnet. She wore a dark gray dress that had seen better days but was impeccably maintained. Her face was fine-boned and composed, and she was carrying the lantern in her left hand with the ease of long habit, and her eyes, when the moonlight caught them as she looked up and noticed him standing at the graveyard gate, were a shade of hazel that he would spend the next several months trying to describe to himself and never quite managing to do adequately. She stopped. He could see the moment of wariness move through her, the instinctive alertness of a woman alone at night encountering an unexpected presence. He removed his hat immediately and held up his free hand. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, "I am sorry to have startled you. I am David Bailey. I run the ranch north of town. I have been hoping to introduce myself." She looked at him for a long, measuring moment. He had the distinct impression that she was doing a great deal of calculating behind those hazel eyes, and that the calculation was rapid and competent. "At the graveyard," she said, "on a Sunday night." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I am aware it is an unusual choice of time and place. I would have introduced myself in a more conventional setting, but I was not sure you would welcome it there as readily." Something shifted in her expression, not quite a softening, but something more like reassessment. "You knew I came here. I have seen your light from my upper pasture," he said, and because he had decided to be honest, he continued, "for close to a year." The silence that followed this statement was considerable. "A year," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him with an expression that was difficult to interpret. He held himself still under it, not fidgeting, because he had already committed to the honesty of the moment and fidgeting would have undermined it. "Mr. Bailey," she finally said, "I am not certain whether that is the most unusual thing a man has ever said to me, or simply the most honest." "With some hope," he said, "it might be both." And for the first time in the pale moonlight of an April night, with the Texas prairie smelling of spring grass and her lantern casting its circle of amber between them, Eudora Callahan almost smiled. It was not a full smile. It was a fraction of a smile, the smallest possible curve at the corner of her mouth. But David Bailey saw it, and it landed somewhere in the middle of his chest with a warmth that he recognized, despite his long unfamiliarity with it, as something consequential. "I need to visit my husband's grave, Mr. Bailey," she said. "Of course," he said. "I will not detain you. I only wanted to introduce myself, and to say that if you should ever find yourself in need of anything, I would consider it a privilege to be of assistance." She nodded once, with a formality that was not coldness but was not yet warmth either, and passed through the gate of the graveyard, and he gave her the privacy of her ritual, walking back to where Roscoe was tied and standing with his hand on the horse's neck, not watching the grave but watching the distant line of the horizon, and trying to understand the odd, quiet exhilaration he felt. He heard her leave 45 minutes later. He did not call after her. He simply listened to her footsteps recede toward town and thought that this was, at minimum, a beginning. He turned out to be correct about that. The following Sunday he was at the graveyard gate again, this time with his hat in his hand from a somewhat greater distance, giving her more room. She noticed him when she crested the rise and stopped, and this time the wariness was less acute. She walked toward the gate at her normal pace. "Mr. Bailey," she said. "Mrs. Callahan," he said. "Good evening." "You came back," she said. "I did," he said. She seemed to consider this. "Why?" "Because I should have introduced myself a year ago," he said, "and I am trying to correct the error." "Once was an introduction," she said. "Twice is something else." "It is, yes," he agreed, not pretending otherwise. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the April night breathed around them both with its smell of grass and distant cedar, and after a moment she said, "You can walk with me to the gate if you like. I will go in alone." "Thank you," he said. He walked with her to the gate. It was perhaps 20 yards, and they walked in silence. But it was a different kind of silence from the one that usually occupied his days, a silence that had another person breathing in it. At the gate she paused and looked at the lantern and then at him. "He was a good man," she said. "Thomas, in case you were wondering what brings me here." "I did not doubt it," he said. "People sometimes think widows come to graves out of guilt," she said, with a directness that suggested she had thought about this a good deal. "I come because I need a place to think, and this is the only place where I can do it without someone needing something from me." He understood this completely. He had his upper pasture for the same reason. "I understand that," he said. She looked at him as though gauging the sincerity of the statement, and apparently found it adequate, because she nodded and went through the gate. He waited for her again that night, at a respectful distance, until her lantern began its return journey. He did not stop her on the way back. He simply watched her light recede toward town, and he stood in the graveyard's shadow and felt something loosening in the locked interior of his chest, like a door that has been painted shut opening along one edge. 3 weeks later, she allowed him to walk her home. It happened because it had begun to rain on her walk to the graveyard, a thin, persistent spring rain that was not dangerous but was thoroughly unpleasant, and she had not brought her shawl, and when she came out of the graveyard after her hour, David was standing under the scrub oak that had become his unofficial waiting post, and he was holding an oilskin coat. "I did not want to interrupt your visit," he said, "but the rain came on fast." She looked at the coat and then at him. "You brought 2 coats." "I have broad shoulders," he said. "I ran back to get mine from Roscoe's saddlebag and it covered the issue." She took the oilskin coat without quite smiling, but close enough to it that he counted it as a victory. She put it on. It was enormously large on her, and she looked, he thought privately, slightly wonderful in it, but he kept this thought appropriately to himself. They walked back toward town through the thin rain, and the silence between them had by now acquired a quality of genuine ease that surprised them both, he thought. At her gate she stopped and started to take off the coat. "Keep it until it dries," he said. "I can collect it from you Sunday if you like." "You plan to be here again Sunday," she said. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, "I plan to be here every Sunday for as long as you will permit it, and I would like you to know that clearly so there is no confusion about my intentions." This time she did smile. It was a real smile, not the fraction she had offered him on the first night, but a full, genuine expression that transformed her face in a way that made something in him very nearly ache. "You are a very straightforward man, Mr. Bailey," she said. "I have found it saves considerable time," he said. She laughed. It was a brief sound, surprised out of her, and she pressed her fingers against her lips immediately afterward as though she had not intended to let it escape. But it had escaped, and David Bailey filed it away in a place he planned to keep safe. "Sunday," she said, and went through her gate. By May they had established a rhythm. He would arrive at the graveyard on Sunday evenings before she did, not by much, just enough to have a moment to collect himself. They would walk together to the gate. She would go in alone. He would wait. She would come out, and they would walk together back to her house, and the distance of half a mile had become, over the weeks, the most nourishing half-mile of his week. He began to learn her. He learned that she had grown up in Tennessee before her family moved west when she was 16, and that she had married Thomas at 19 and followed him to Texas because she had loved him, and because the frontier represented to her something she could only describe as room. Room to be a person, rather than a daughter waiting to become someone's wife. He learned that she had wanted that room and had never entirely found it in the way she had imagined, which she said without bitterness, only as a fact she had arrived at. He learned that she was fiercely proud, not in a vain or rigid way, but in the way of someone who has had to fight for the right to manage their own affairs, and was not about to surrender it carelessly. She managed the house and the children and the debt with a precision that impressed him deeply, and when he made the mistake, once, of phrasing a question about her finances in a way that could have sounded like he was positioning himself to offer assistance, the look she gave him was so immediate and clear that he backed away from the implication so quickly that she actually laughed again. He learned that she had a dry, precise sense of humor that she deployed sparingly and to devastating effect. He learned that she was not a woman who talked simply to fill silence, and that the silences between them were therefore genuine rather than uncomfortable. He learned that she spoke about Thomas without prompting when the occasion called for it, without either performing grief or concealing it, and that this unself-conscious honesty about her own interior life was one of the things he found most remarkable about her. She was learning him too, he could tell. She asked him questions that were direct and without social camouflage. She asked him why he had never married, and he was honest with her, that he had been too busy building the ranch through his 20s, and that by the time the ranch was built, he had gotten so accustomed to his own company that the idea of changing it had seemed more like a disruption than a prospect, and that he was aware this said something unflattering about him. "It says you are a man who knows himself," she said. "Not always to good effect," he said. "Knowing yourself to bad effect is still better than not knowing yourself at all," she said. He thought about this for a long time after that evening. In June, the children became real to him rather than abstract. He had known about Henry and Clara, of course, but he had carefully kept his Sunday evening presence separate from the domestic life of the family, understanding that any overreach in that direction would be far more serious a miscalculation than any he had made so far. It was Clara who broke the separation, because Clara was 6 years old and had, apparently, inherited not only her mother's hair but her mother's directness. Eudora had mentioned to him in passing that Clara had been asking about the man who walked her home on Sundays. Eudora had told Clara simply that he was a neighbor who was being kind, and Clara had apparently found this answer insufficient and said so in clear terms. 2 Sundays later, David arrived at the graveyard gate to find Eudora accompanied by both children. Henry stood at his mother's side with the careful, composed expression of a boy who had decided to be the man of the family at 9 years old and was performing that role with exhausting seriousness. Clara stood slightly in front of her mother and looked at David with wide brown eyes that contained a frank, unabashed appraisal. "You are the man," she announced. "Clara," Eudora said, with the tone of a mother who has already tried and failed to moderate this child. "I am a man, yes," David said seriously. "Mama says you are a neighbor," Clara said. "I am a neighbor," David agreed. "Our neighbor on the other side is Mr. Pickering," Clara said, "and he is very old and smells of tobacco, and he does not walk Mama home." "Clara," Eudora said again, and David had to work very hard not to laugh. "I do not smell of tobacco," David said. "No," Clara agreed. "You smell like horses. That is better." Henry had not spoken during this exchange, but David caught the older boy watching him with the kind of careful, assessing intelligence that should not have been in the eyes of a 9-year-old. David met his gaze directly and nodded once, man to man, and something in Henry's shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, which was perhaps the most that the boy could offer in terms of acceptance right now, and David respected it fully. That evening, Eudora walked into the graveyard with her lantern, and the four of them waited for her outside. Henry at the fence post, Clara crouching to examine something in the grass, and David leaning on the opposite fence post, watching the amber light through the iron fence. It was not, he thought, an unpleasant picture. It was actually, in the honest and quiet part of him, a picture that caused something quite warm to move through his chest. When Eudora came out, Clara immediately took her hand and began reporting on the interesting things she had found in the grass, and Henry fell in beside his mother on the other side, and David walked a pace back, giving the family its space, and Eudora looked over her shoulder at him, once with an expression that he could only describe as a kind of private acknowledgement, the look of one person who recognizes that another person is being careful with something precious, and appreciates it. He walked them all home that night, and stood at the gate until they were inside, and turned back toward the road home with the particular feeling of a man who has been trusted with something, and intends to honor that trust. The summer brought heat and hard work, and a string of ordinary days that were, David discovered, not ordinary at all when they included Eudora Callahan in them. She had, sometime around late June, stopped limiting their acquaintance to Sunday evenings. This had happened not by any explicit agreement but by a series of small, gradual expansions. He had encountered her at the mercantile, and they had walked together to the post office. He had brought a surplus of plums from the ranch orchard and left them at her door, and she had sent Henry over the next day with a jar of plum preserves, and a note that was brief and formal and funny in a way that only revealed itself on the second reading. He had, at the urging of his ranch hand Ned, attended the summer social at the town hall, and Eudora had been there, and they had spent most of the evening in conversation in a corner, while Clara fell asleep in a chair nearby, and Henry played with the other children with a slightly stiff, overworked enjoyment that made David want to simply give the boy permission to be 9. He had danced with her once, just once, at the social. The fiddle player had started something slow and the floor was not crowded, and he had asked her with appropriate formality, and she had accepted with appropriate composure, and they had danced with the correct and respectable space between them that 1879 required, and he had held her hand lightly and felt the warmth of her palm through the cotton of her glove, and when the dance ended she looked up at him with those hazel eyes and said quietly, "Thank you, Mr. Bailey," and he said, "Thank you, Mrs. Callahan," and they walked off the floor in separate directions because that was what was done, and he spent the rest of the evening being conscious of exactly where she was in the room without looking at her directly, which was exhausting and excellent. The following Sunday he told her that he had been thinking about her debt to the Harlow Creek Savings and Trust, not in the sense of offering to manage it, he added quickly, but because a man at the bank named Carson had a reputation for finding reasons to foreclose on properties that belonged to widows and unattached women, and David felt she ought to know this if she did not already. She looked at him sharply. "How do you know about my account?" "I do not know the details," he said carefully. "I know you have a debt because you mentioned it once in a way that suggested it was a concern. And I know Carson's reputation because 2 other women in this county have lost properties in the last 3 years under circumstances that were technically legal and morally contemptible." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know about Carson. I have been managing the payments without a single default, and I intend to continue doing so." "I know you have," he said. "I am not suggesting otherwise. I am saying that Carson may try to find another angle. Frontier banking laws are not designed to protect women, and a man like Carson knows how to exploit the gaps." The look she gave him was not entirely grateful and not entirely suspicious, and contained something of both, which he thought was fair. She was a woman who had been managing her own affairs without assistance, and the information he was offering, while well-intentioned, walked a line between genuine helpfulness and the kind of paternalistic concern she had every right to be wary of. "If he moves on the property unlawfully," he said, "I have a lawyer in Fort Worth who I trust, not to take over your affairs, to give you options." "His name," she said. "Robert Hale," he said. "He practices out of the Belknap Street office. He is an honest man, which is rarer in Fort Worth than it should be." She filed the name away with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything she did and said, "Thank you, Mr. Bailey." "David," he said. The word was out before he fully weighed it. They had been Mr. Bailey and Mrs. Callahan for 7 months of Sunday evenings and summer socials and plum preserves and slow dances, and the formality had become, he realized, something he wanted to step past. She looked at him. The evening was long and golden around them, and the graveyard gate was 10 yards ahead, and the light on the prairie was the particular soft amber of a July dusk that makes everything look like a painting of itself. "David," she said, and the way she said it, quietly and carefully, as though she were testing the weight of the word in her mouth and finding it good, was one of the finer moments of his life to that point. "Eudora," he said. She went into the graveyard with her lantern, and he stood outside the gate and looked at the open sky, and felt the warmth of the July evening on his shoulders, and thought that he was in love with her. He had known it was coming, had felt it building for months with the steady, inevitable quality of weather moving in from the horizon, but the moment of knowing it entirely was right now, standing outside a graveyard in Harlow Creek, Texas, on a July evening in 1879, with the smell of dry grass and cedar around him, and the amber light of her lantern visible through the iron fence. He did not tell her that evening. He was not an impulsive man by nature, and he understood the weight of what he felt and had no interest in saying it carelessly. But he also understood, standing in the July dusk, that he was finished waiting. He was going to say it. He was going to say it properly, when the moment was right, and he was going to mean it entirely. In August, a problem arrived, as problems in the Texas frontier tended to, without particular courtesy or advance warning. The problem was a man named Earl Duckett, who had arrived in Harlow Creek 3 months prior and had been making quiet inquiries about properties in the area. He was 40-something, lean and watchful, with the particular air of a man who had made money in ways he would not specify directly. He had already bought 2 parcels of land on the south side of town, through methods that involved paper trails complex enough to make the transactions technically legal, and the previous owners effectively voiceless. He had, it emerged in the second week of August, expressed interest in Eudora's property. She told David about it on the Sunday evening, not with panic but with a controlled anger that was, he thought, more alarming than panic would have been because it indicated she understood precisely what was happening. "He approached me directly," she said, "at the Mercantile in front of Mrs. Harper and the Alderson boy, so there were witnesses. He said he had admired my property and wished to make an offer." "What kind of offer?" "Below market value," she said. He framed it charitably, said he understood I was managing a loan, implied it would be a relief to have the matter settled. Her voice was steady and her jaw was set in the way he had come to recognize as her most dangerous expression. He all but said that a woman in my position ought to be grateful for any reasonable offer. David felt something cold and specific move through him. "What did you say?" "I thanked him politely for his interest and told him I was not selling," she said. "And then I came home and I wrote to Robert Hale in Fort Worth." He looked at her. The evening light was in her hair and her eyes were bright with the controlled fury of a person who has been underestimated. "You already wrote to him," he said. "I wrote to him the same afternoon," she said. "What did Hale say?" "I have not received the reply yet. I wrote 3 days ago." She paused. "But I know what he will say because I am not ignorant of my own situation. Duckett will have someone approach Carson at the bank. They will find a technicality in the loan terms, something small and obscure, and they will use it to pressure me into selling." She was right. David knew at the moment she said it because he had seen the same pattern with the other women who had lost their properties, and the clarity of her analysis was simultaneously impressive and infuriating on her behalf. "There is another option," he said. She looked at him. "Hale can review the loan documents for irregularities," he said. "If Carson has been handling the account honestly, there will be nothing to find. If he has been shading things, which given his reputation is plausible, Hale finding it before Duckett can act on it gives you standing to negotiate new terms with a different lender." "I do not have access to a different lender," she said. "I do," he said. The silence was immediate and significant. "No," she said. "Eudora," he said. "No," she said again, with the particular tone of a woman who has thought this through faster than the conversation has actually reached it. "I understand what you are offering, David, and I am grateful for the impulse behind it. But I will not accept financial assistance from a man I am not married to, because it would compromise both my position and your reputation, and because it is not what I need." He thought about this for a moment. He thought about her autonomy and her pride and the absolute integrity of both. He thought about the fact that she was correct on every practical point she had made. And he thought about the thing he had been planning to say for a month. "What if we were married?" he said. The question came out with less ceremony than he had intended, but with, he thought, sufficient directness that it could not be misunderstood. She stared at him. "That is not," she said slowly, "a romantic proposal, David." "No," he agreed. "It was not. It was a poorly phrased version of something I have been meaning to say properly for a month." He gathered himself. "Eudora, I love you. I have loved you since approximately March, and possibly before that, and I have been trying to say it at the right moment for weeks. I did not intend to say it in the context of banking difficulties, and I would like to have said it better." She was looking at him with an expression that he could not entirely read, which was unusual because he had spent months learning to read her expressions. "You love me," she said. "Yes," he said. "You are not saying it because of Duckett or Carson or the loan. I am saying it because I have been standing outside a graveyard on Sunday evenings for 7 months," he said. "And because you are the most remarkable person I have ever known, and because the Sunday evenings are the best hours of my week, and because I would like them to be every hour of every day if you will consider it." She was quiet for a long time. The Texas evening settled around them. A cricket started up somewhere in the dry grass. The lantern sat on the ground between them, its light steady and warm. "I love Thomas," she said finally. "I want you to know that I am not looking for a replacement for him. I am not looking for someone to fill a shape he left." "I know," he said. "I am looking," she said, with the careful deliberateness of a woman choosing every word with full awareness of its weight, "for something that is its own thing, not a continuation, not a consolation, something that is only itself." "That is exactly what I am offering," he said. "I know that too," she said quietly. She picked up the lantern from the ground and looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at him, and the expression on her face was not the controlled composure he was accustomed to, but something open and vulnerable and decided all at once. "Yes," she said. He had thought, in his imagination of this moment, that he might feel triumphant or relieved or any number of things. What he actually felt was a quiet, deep, comprehensive gladness, as though something that had been slightly wrong about the world for a very long time had been gently, permanently corrected. "Yes," he repeated, to make sure he had heard correctly. "Do not make me say it 3 times," she said, and there was the dry humor, unmistakable, threading through the seriousness, and he laughed, and she almost laughed, and he reached out and took her free hand in his and held it, and she let him. They stood there for a moment in the fading August evening with their hands together, and then she said practically, "We should tell the children before anyone else in town." "Agreed," he said. "And I would like to continue visiting Thomas's grave," she said. "You will always have my full support in doing so," he said. She squeezed his hand once, and then she straightened and became herself again, composed and direct, though the warmth in her eyes did not go anywhere, and they walked back toward town in the August dark with their hands together, and it was the finest walk David Bailey had ever taken in his life. The matter of Earl Duckett resolved itself with rather less drama than it might have, in part because of Robert Hale's prompt reply to Eudora's letter, and in part because the situation changed fundamentally once David Bailey's engagement to Eudora Callahan became known in Harlow Creek. Hale's letter arrived on a Thursday and confirmed exactly what Eudora had anticipated. The loan documents contained a clause that Carson had apparently been using selectively, a clause regarding payment timeliness that had a definition vague enough to be interpreted as a default even when no actual missed payments had occurred. It was the kind of clause that required a lawyer to untangle, and the kind of clause that men like Duckett and Carson counted on their targets not having access to a lawyer to identify. Hale's recommendation was that Eudora refinance the loan with a more reputable institution before Carson could act on the clause. David provided the introduction to a Fort Worth bank whose manager he had known for 6 years, and the transaction, when completed, was entirely and correctly in Eudora's name. She made this point herself, with absolute clarity, before the paperwork was signed, and David made the point to the Fort Worth banker, equally clearly, that this was how things were to be arranged, and that there was no ambiguity about whose property and whose debt it was. It occurred to him that this insistence on her own autonomy was one of the things he loved most about her. It did not diminish him in any way to be with a woman who knew her own worth. It enlarged something in the world. Duckett apparently received word, through whatever channels such men used, that the Callahan property was no longer a viable target, and he did not approach Eudora again. He left Harlow Creek in October, which was, David thought, the best outcome that could reasonably have been hoped for. The children's response to the news of the engagement was characteristic. Clara said, "Will we move to the ranch?" And when Eudora said yes, Clara said, "Good, because Mr. Pickering's tobacco smell comes through the fence," and then ran off to play. Henry was different. He received the news quietly and went outside and sat on the porch steps for a long time, and David eventually came and sat beside him, not saying anything, just being there. After a while Henry said, "You will take care of her." It was not a question. "Yes," David said. "And you?" Henry looked at the yard for a moment. "I know how to help on a ranch," he said. "My father taught me to ride." "He did a good job," David said. "I have seen you on horseback." Henry looked at him with Thomas Callahan's serious brown eyes and said, "I am not calling you father." "I would not ask you to," David said. "But I will not be rude to you," Henry said, with the exacting precision of a 10-year-old working out the terms of a new arrangement. "I appreciate that," David said. Henry nodded once and went back inside, and that was, David understood, as complete an acceptance as the boy was capable of offering right now, and it was genuine and it was enough, and he valued it exactly as it was. They were married in October 1879, on a Saturday morning at the Harlow Creek Methodist Church, in front of a congregation that was approximately half genuinely pleased for them and half intensely curious, which was more or less the expected ratio for any wedding in a small frontier town. Eudora wore a dress that was not white, because she had not the money for a new dress of any kind and saw no reason to pretend otherwise, but was a deep, warm blue that suited her extraordinarily well, and she had let Clara put wildflowers in her hair. And when David saw her walking up the church aisle with Henry on one side and Clara on the other, his throat did something unexpected that he had to work around before he could speak his vows clearly. He had written his vows himself, which was not required by the ceremony but which he had felt was important. He said, among other things, that he promised to be worthy of the trust she placed in him, and to stand beside her rather than in front of her, and to love her not as a man loves something he possesses, but as a man loves something that enlarges him by existing. He had worked on this particular sentence for 3 days and was reasonably satisfied with it. Eudora's vows were shorter and, he thought, more eloquent for their brevity. She said she promised to love him honestly, which she said was more demanding than loving him perfectly because honesty required her to show him herself as she actually was, and that she chose to do so. She said she trusted him with that. She said she was glad. He kissed her with the appropriate restraint that the Methodist Church required, and the congregation made the sounds that congregations make at weddings, and Clara cheered with a volume entirely disproportionate to her size. And Henry, standing at the end of the front pew, was observed by at least 3 people to be blinking rather rapidly, which under the circumstances was accepted as the emotional equivalent of a full public display. The reception was at the town hall, because the ranch house was not yet prepared to host the crowd, and there was roast beef, and 3 kinds of pie, and a fiddle player who was considerably better than the one at the summer social. And David danced with Eudora 4 times, which was 2 more than strict propriety required, but which nobody appeared to object to. Perhaps because the way they looked at each other during the dances made it abundantly clear that this was not performance but something quite genuine. At one point during the evening, when they had stepped outside onto the hall's porch for a moment of relative quiet, Eudora took his hand and turned his palm up and looked at it the way she sometimes looked at things she was trying to understand fully. "I am happy," she said, in a tone that was slightly surprised. "Good," he said. "I did not expect to be this happy," she said. "I had hoped for content. I had thought content would be sufficient and perhaps all I could reasonably expect." "Content is not nothing," he said. "No," she agreed. "But this is more than content." She looked up at him. "You are more than I was looking for." He turned her hand over and brought it to his lips, which was a gesture more overtly tender than anything he had permitted himself since they had been acquainted, and she let him, and the October night came around them both, cool and clear and smelling of wood smoke and cedar. "You are more than I had any right to find," he said. They moved Eudora and the children to the ranch house in November, a process that involved considerably more organization than David had anticipated, because Eudora moved with the thoroughness of a person who intends to do a thing properly or not at all. Every item in the house was assessed, packed, or disposed of with a systematic efficiency that he found simultaneously admirable and slightly overwhelming. His ranch hands Ned, and the other 2 year-round men, Marcus and Pete, watched the operation from a respectful distance, with expressions that suggested they were revising some of their assumptions about what it meant to have a woman in the house. The ranch house had been a bachelor house for 12 years, which meant it was structurally sound, well-maintained, and deeply uninhabited in the human sense of the word. Within 3 weeks of Eudora's arrival, this changed so completely that David sometimes stood in the kitchen doorway in the morning and simply looked at the room, at the dried herbs hanging from the beam and the children's boots by the door and the pattern of sunlight on a tablecloth that had not been there before, and felt the specific, private amazement of a man who has been given something he had stopped believing in. Clara adapted to ranch life with the boundless practicality of a 6-year-old who has decided that horses are the finest thing in existence and that this is now her primary concern. She followed Ned around the stables with a focused, earnest interest that he initially found startling and eventually found touching, and he took it upon himself to teach her the names of every horse on the property, which Clara absorbed and retained with perfect accuracy. Henry was quieter in his adaptation, which was true to his nature, but David watched him carefully and saw the gradual unthawing that happened when a serious, careful boy is given a consistent environment and consistent expectations. Henry began to take on tasks around the ranch with a deliberate pride that David recognized, because he had felt it himself at that age, the particular satisfaction of doing hard work and having it matter. He began to ask questions, not about farming or animals only, but careful, specific questions about how things worked and why, which David answered fully, because a boy who asks good questions deserves complete answers. There was one evening in late November when David came in from the north pasture after a hard day of fence repair, and found Henry in the kitchen studying a map of the county that he had apparently found in the study. The boy looked up with a composed expression and then, apparently deciding something, said, "The Henderson parcel to the north. Is it available?" David looked at him. "What do you know about the Henderson parcel?" "Ned mentioned it," Henry said. "He said it would extend the north grazing range considerably." David sat down across from him, and they talked about it for 20 minutes with the seriousness of two people who are both genuinely interested in the subject. And at the end, Henry rolled up the map with the efficiency of someone who intends to think about this further and said, "Good evening," and went to find his sister. And David sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight and thought that this boy was going to be someone remarkable. He told Eudora about it that night. She was at her dressing table taking the pins from her hair, and she met his eyes in the mirror with an expression that was pride and grief wound together in the way that only a mother who sees her late husband in her living child can produce. "He is so much like Thomas in some ways," she said. "The seriousness, the thinking before speaking." "He is also very much himself," David said. "Yes," she agreed. "He is." She set the last pin down and her hair fell to her shoulders, and she turned to look at him directly rather than through the mirror. "Thank you for spending that time with him." "I like talking to him," David said. "He is interesting." She looked at him with that expression that always made him feel seen entirely, which was occasionally alarming and consistently wonderful. "Come here," she said. He crossed the room and she reached up and put her hand against the side of his face, not in a tentative way but in the full, uncomplicated way of a woman who has decided she is allowed to do this and is doing it without reservation. He covered her hand with his and she leaned her head against his chest, and they stood there in the lamplight for a while with the autumn wind coming off the prairie outside the window, and it was as close to perfect as anything David Bailey had been able to imagine. Winter on the ranch was hard work and long hours, and a particular kind of enforced intimacy that came from being inside together during the coldest months, and it suited them both better than either had expected. Eudora proved herself capable with the cattle side of things in ways that surprised the ranch hands and did not surprise David at all, because he had understood for months that this was a woman with wide-ranging practical intelligence. She had learned the accounts within 2 months of their marriage and had found an inefficiency in the supply ordering that saved them $12 a season, which was not a fortune but which was real. She also found, in the winter evenings when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, a way of sitting with him by the fire that was nothing like the silence of his bachelor years. She would read or sew or write letters, and he would go over ranch documents or simply think, and the silence was full of her presence, warm and companionable, and he would sometimes look across at her over the top of whatever he was reading and catch her looking at him, and she would not look away, which was one of the things he loved most about her. They talked. This was perhaps the thing that struck him most forcefully about being married to her. He had not anticipated how much there was to say, and how the saying of it would feel like an unburdening that he had not known he was carrying. He told her things about his father, about the years of building the ranch, about the loneliness that he had managed and organized and refused to examine too closely. She told him things about Tennessee and about the first years of her marriage and about the particular quality of loving someone and not being entirely known by them, which she said without criticism of Thomas but as a simple truth. "Did you feel known by him?" David asked once. She thought about it carefully. "In the way that people know each other when they are very young and are learning to be grown," she said. "We grew up together in a sense, but we were always slightly formal with each other, as though we were being careful." "Were you happy?" "Yes," she said. "And also yes, there was something missing. Both things are true and both things are allowed to be true." He understood this. He had lived his whole adult life in the space between something being adequate and something being right, and he recognized the description precisely. "I do not feel formal with you," she said. "No," he agreed. "I feel," she said, looking for the word actual. He thought this was perhaps the finest thing anyone had ever said to him. By the time spring came around again, the ranch had settled into a new shape that felt as though it had always had this shape, which he knew was one of the markers of something genuinely right. The children had grown into the land the way children do when the land gives them room. Clara had learned to ride with a competence that made Ned quietly proud, and Henry had taken on genuine responsibility for the north fence line, which was a real job that got done correctly because Henry did it. The Sunday evenings continued. Eudora still carried her lantern to the graveyard, and David still walked with her. And sometimes the children came, and sometimes they did not. And at the gate, she still went in alone, and he still waited. And the ritual had found its natural place within the larger life they had built together, honored and intact. On a Sunday evening in April, a year almost exactly from the evening he had first spoken to her, they were walking back from the graveyard together, and the prairie was doing its spring extravagance again, flowers between the grass stems and the air smelling of everything new, and Eudora was quiet in the way that was not empty but full. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She considered for a moment. "I am thinking about the year," she said, "all of it from the beginning." "Which beginning?" "Yours," she said, looking at him sideways with that almost smile. "A year of watching my light from the upper pasture." He felt the warmth that this always produced, the slightly embarrassed pleasure of being known completely. "Yes. That is an extraordinary thing to have done," she said. "I am aware it sounds peculiar," he said. "Not peculiar," she said. "Devoted, before you even knew me." She paused. "There is something very moving about that, David, that you watched over me for a year without my knowing." "I could not have explained it if you had asked me at the time," he said. "I only knew that the light mattered to me." She stopped walking. They were on the road between the graveyard and the ranch in the last wide light of the April evening, and she turned to look at him fully, and he stopped beside her. "I am going to say something," she said, "and I want you to know that I have thought about it carefully, and I mean it completely." "All right," he said. "I love you," she said. "Not because you protected me from Duckett, or because you were patient with Henry, or because you gave my children a home and gave me the courtesy of making it mine as well. All of those things are true. But the reason I love you is simpler than any of them. I love you because when I am with you I am entirely myself, and I have never in my life felt that before, and I had not known until you that it was possible." He looked at her in the April evening, this woman who had carried a lantern through the dark every Sunday for a year and had not known he was watching, and the love he felt for her was not the tentative, cautious thing it had been when he had first named it to himself in July. It was full and complete and rooted in something that felt permanent. "I love you," he said, and the simplicity of it after everything they had said to each other was exactly right. She stepped forward and he put his arms around her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and they stood on the April road with the prairie flowing out around them in every direction, and the sky going amber and rose in the west. And it was, David Bailey thought, as correct as anything had ever been. The summer of 1880 brought two things of significance to the Bailey Ranch. The first was the Henderson parcel, which came available in May when old Henderson decided to move to San Antonio to be near his daughter. David bought it, and at the signing of the papers brought Henry along, and let him examine the survey documents, and afterward Henry said, quietly, that the north grazing extension would support approximately 40 more head if the summer had decent rainfall. He said this with the careful, researched certainty of someone who had done the arithmetic beforehand, and David told him he was exactly right, and the look on the boy's face was 10 years old and 30 years old at the same time, and wonderful. The second thing was that Eudora told David in late June that she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the early morning before the children were up, with the particular quality of private seriousness she reserved for things that required the full attention of both of them. He was at the table with his coffee, and she sat across from him, and she said it plainly, watching his face. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her, and she looked at him, and he felt something enormous and quiet and completely encompassing. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am well," she said. "Tired in the mornings, but well." He reached across the table and took her hand and said nothing for a moment because he did not trust his voice to be steady, and she seemed to understand this because she waited, watching him with those hazel eyes that had been watching him honestly for a year and a half now. "I did not expect this," he said finally. "Neither did I," she said. "Or I expected it was possible, but not that it would happen this quickly." "Are you pleased?" he asked. He needed to know this because it was her body and her life, and the decision had not been entirely his to make. "Yes," she said, simply and completely. "Are you—" "Eudora," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady, but he did not care. "I am more pleased than I have the words for." She squeezed his hand, and the morning light came through the kitchen window and fell across the table between them, and he thought that the kitchen had never seemed more completely inhabited. They told the children together, at supper that evening. Clara's response was immediate and enthusiastic, and largely concerned with the possibility of the baby being a girl, which she felt would correct an imbalance in the household. Henry's response was, characteristically, more considered. He asked 3 practical questions about the situation: whether the ranch would need to expand its accounts, whether the south bedroom would need to be cleared, and whether his mother had seen Doc Waverly. When all 3 questions were answered satisfactorily, he nodded, and then said with an awkward but genuine warmth that cost him something, "I am glad, Mother," and returned to his supper. Eudora's eyes were bright when she met David's across the table, and he smiled at her with the full, unguarded openness that he had spent most of his adult life not permitting himself, and it felt entirely natural to do so. The pregnancy proceeded well through the summer and into the autumn. Eudora was the kind of person who managed difficulty by continuing to function at full capacity, which both reassured and occasionally alarmed David, who had to remind himself on several occasions that she was not brittle and did not need to be treated as such. She continued managing the accounts and the garden and the household with her usual systematic efficiency, and allowed him to take over the heavier physical tasks with a gracious practicality that did not wound her pride, because she understood the difference between being managed and being cared for. He cared for her. He was not always eloquent about it, not the kind of man who made speeches, but he showed it in the steady, constant way of someone for whom this caring was not a performance, but the natural orientation of all his effort. He made sure there was always wood split, and the water brought from the well before she had to ask. He sat with her in the evenings with one hand at the small of her back because she had mentioned once, in passing, that it eased the ache. He learned what she needed before she said it, not by mysticism but by paying close and loving attention. She caught him at it once. She turned from the stove and found him watching her with that particular focused regard that she had come to recognize as pure David Bailey, undisguised and complete, and she said, "You are doing it again." "What am I doing?" he asked. "Looking at me as though you are memorizing me," she said. "I am," he said. She set down the spoon and came to him and put her palm against his cheek in the way she had done that first night by the dressing table, and he put his hand over hers, and she said, "You do not need to memorize me. I am not going anywhere." "I know," he said. "I just like the looking." She leaned up and kissed him, properly and without ceremony, in the kitchen in the middle of the afternoon, with the October sun coming through the windows, and it was one of those moments that is complete in itself, needing nothing added or taken away. The child was born in February 1881, on a cold, clear night when the stars were spread across the Texas sky in their winter configuration, dense and brilliant. Doc Waverly was there, and the neighbor woman Mrs. Alderson, who had experience with births, and David was outside the bedroom door with Henry and Clara, doing what men and children did in those situations, which was wait and listen and try not to show how much they were doing both. Clara fell asleep against David's arm at some point in the small hours, and he let her stay there, and Henry sat across from him with his father's serious eyes and did not sleep at all, and they sat together through the night with the particular silent companionship of two people waiting for the same thing. Just before dawn, the sound of a baby crying came through the door. Henry looked up. David looked at the door. Clara stirred and blinked. Mrs. Alderson opened the door and said, "A boy, both well." Henry made a sound that was very nearly a laugh, and Clara said, "Oh," in a small, slightly disappointed voice, and David closed his eyes for a moment and breathed out with the full, released force of everything he had been holding since supper the previous evening. He went in, and Eudora was propped against the pillows with the exhaustion of someone who has done the hardest possible work and knows it, and she was looking at the small wrapped bundle in her arms, with an expression of such unguarded tenderness that David had to stop at the door for a moment before he could cross the room. He sat beside her and she turned the bundle so he could see the face, red and ancient-looking and absolutely perfect, and he touched one finger to the baby's cheek with the same care he would have given something very fine and very fragile. "Hello," he said, which was not a profound thing to say, but which was what came out. "Hello," Eudora said, to the baby or to him or to both. They named him James, James Thomas Bailey. The Thomas was Eudora's choosing, and David's entire contribution to this discussion had been to say, immediately and without reservation, that he thought it was exactly right. James Thomas Bailey grew into his name with the comfortable, sunny ease of a child who has arrived into a household that was ready for him. He had Eudora's auburn coloring, which Clara found satisfying on principle, and he had something of David's dark eyes, which emerged slowly through his first months, and he had a round, cheerful temperament that provided a pleasing contrast to Henry's careful seriousness and Clara's fierce focus. The ranch settled into its full shape through 1881 and into 1882. The Henderson parcel proved its value in the first summer, the extended grazing supporting the additional head that Henry had predicted with his 10-year-old arithmetic. David expanded the cattle operation modestly but with precision, not over-leveraging, building something sustainable rather than spectacular, which was the philosophy that had made the ranch solid in the first place. Henry turned 13 in 1882, and the careful, composed boy was becoming a composed and capable young man whose contribution to the ranch was no longer ceremonial but real. He managed the north fence line and the north herd rotation with a quiet authority that the ranch hands respected, not because he was the owner's stepson, but because he was competent and fair, and most importantly, reliably right about the things he said. David watched him and thought, not for the first time, that Thomas Callahan's serious brown eyes looked out at the world from a face that was going to do something worth seeing. Clara, at 9, was a force of nature with a particular specialty in horses that Ned had long since given up trying to moderate and had instead channeled into genuine skill. She could manage any horse on the property, calm the difficult ones and extend the ones who needed extending, and she spoke about horses the way some people speak about music, with a fluency that suggested the subject was organizing itself naturally in her mind into patterns and relationships that she could read without effort. James, at 1, was a person of considerable physical ambition and no judgment whatsoever, which kept Eudora moving constantly and afforded the older children endless entertainment. And David and Eudora were, in the specific and unpretentious language of a man who had stopped pretending to himself about what he wanted, entirely and comprehensively happy. Not without the ordinary difficulties of a working ranch and a growing family, and the frontier demands that 1882 Texas made on everyone who lived in it. There were hard seasons and difficult negotiations, and the persistent, specific injustice of a legal system that still required the constant vigilance of any woman trying to hold property in her own right. When the Texas state legislature considered amendments to the married women's property laws in 1882, Eudora followed the proceedings with close attention, writing to her Fort Worth lawyer, and to the county representative, and to two women she had been in correspondence with in Austin who were, in their careful, persistent way, pushing for the amendments to have actual teeth. David supported this completely and practically, which included several conversations with men in Harlow Creek who held contrary views, conversations that he conducted without hostility, but with the firm, uncomplicated logic of someone who has simply decided that the correct position on a thing is the correct position on a thing. Several of these men changed their stated views. One did not, but he was, David thought, probably the least important voice in the room anyway. The Sunday evenings continued through all of it. Eudora still walked to the graveyard. The lantern was the same lantern, replaced twice over the years as old ones wore out, but always the same amber warmth, the same steady circle of light. The children came sometimes and did not come other times, and James, once he was old enough, occasionally came along on his father's shoulders and grabbed at the stars with fat, hopeful fingers and understood nothing about where they were going and was happy anyway. In the spring of 1883, when the wildflowers were doing their annual extravagance across the prairie and the smell of new growth was in the air, Eudora stood at Thomas Callahan's grave on a Sunday evening and said the things she said when she was there, which David did not know the specific content of, because he still waited outside the gate always. She had visited the grave every Sunday for close to 5 years now, and the ritual had become one of the fixed stars of her week, as it had been before David, and as it continued to be within the life they had built together. When she came out of the gate that evening, he was there as he always was, and she took his arm as she always did now, and they walked the road back toward the ranch in the April dusk with the cattle visible in the north pasture, and the house lights visible from the rise and the smell of supper on the air from where Clara had apparently taken it upon herself to start the pot. "Do you know what today is?" she asked. "April," he said. "April," she agreed. "And do you remember what you told me the first time you spoke to me?" he thought back. "I told you I had been watching your light for a year." "Yes," she said. "That was 5 years ago." He looked at her. The April evening was on her face, and her hair and her eyes were bright with something that was composed of equal parts humor and feeling, which was, he thought, the most characteristically Eudora expression she possessed. "5 years," he said. "6 since you first saw the light," she said. He thought about the man who had stood in the upper pasture 6 years ago watching a small amber light move through the dark toward a graveyard, not knowing who carried it or why, only knowing it mattered. "That man did not know what he was looking at," he said. "He knew enough to keep looking," she said. He stopped walking and turned toward her and took both her hands, and she looked up at him with those hazel eyes, and the April prairie was wide and flowering in every direction around them. And James's voice drifted from the house on the hill in the cheerful, incomprehensible narrative of a 2-year-old who has found something interesting, and Clara's laugh carried down the slope, and somewhere behind them the sound of Henry's horse coming in from the north pasture. "I would watch it another 100 years," he said. "You will not need to," she said. "I am right here." He leaned his forehead against hers, and she closed her eyes, and they stood in the April road with the world arranged around them in all its ordinary, extraordinary detail. And he thought about the particular grace of a life that had come to be exactly as it should, not by plan or by deserving, but by the accumulation of all the small and real and loving choices that had been made along the way. He thought about the graveyard and the light and the year of Sundays he had spent watching from a distance, and he thought about the courage it had taken her to carry that lantern out into the dark alone every week, keeping faith with a grief that she carried honestly rather than concealing it. And he thought that it was entirely typical of her that the thing that had shown him who she was had been an act of private devotion rather than a performance. She opened her eyes and looked at him with the full directness that was the most characteristic thing about her, that quality of looking and being seen and allowing the looking in return. "Come home," she said. They walked up the hill together toward the house with its lamplight and its sounds of children, and the April sky above them went from rose to deep blue to the first stars of the evening, and the lantern, which she had set on the gate-post when she took his arm, cast its amber light behind them on the road, faithful and warm and steady, as it always had been. There were more Sunday evenings after that, and more seasons on the ranch, and more of the ordinary good hard work of a life built with intention and love. Henry grew into the man those serious brown eyes had promised, and he took on the management of the ranch expansion to the east with a competence that made David genuinely proud, and that he had the wisdom to say so aloud, because a boy who grows into a man deserves to hear the plain acknowledgment of it. Clara became a horsewoman of genuine reputation in the county, and at 17 began working with the ranches nearby to train difficult horses, which she did with a quiet authority that made people forget she was 17, because competence does not have an age. James grew into his cheerful temperament, and his father's dark eyes and his mother's auburn hair and his grandfather Thomas's precise, careful thinking, and the combination produced a person who was excellent company and reliably right about cattle prices, which are both, in their way, valuable qualities. Eudora managed the ranch accounts and her correspondence and her garden, and the ongoing business of being the kind of woman who knew her own worth in a time and place that did not always agree, and she did it with the dry-humored, undeflectable competence that had been the first thing David had properly understood about her, and the thing that had never once diminished in all the years since. And on Sunday evenings, through all of it, the lantern went to the graveyard and came back, and the man who had watched its light for a year before he found the courage to speak was there at the gate, waiting, as he had been from the beginning, not because he needed to be, not because she required the escort, but because some things, once they become true, do not stop being true, and watching over the light of Eudora Callahan was, and would remain, the finest privilege of David Bailey's life. The graveyard on the edge of Harlow Creek held many names by 1885, as graveyards in frontier towns necessarily did. Thomas Callahan's marker had been replaced with a proper stone in 1880, which Eudora had ordered and paid for from the ranch accounts, an act that David had understood without being told and had respected without comment. The stone was plain and clean, and it said what it needed to say, which was his name and his dates and the words "beloved father," which were Henry and Clara's choosing and were, David thought, entirely correct. He had sat beside that stone himself once on a morning when Eudora was in town and the children were occupied. He had not said anything in particular. He had simply sat for a while with the honest acknowledgment of a man who holds the life and happiness of the woman and children that another man had loved, and who understands the weight of that holding. He had sat there long enough to feel, in whatever way such things can be felt, that the obligation was understood and accepted, and then he had stood up and put his hat back on and walked home, and had not mentioned it to anyone. He did not think it would have surprised Eudora if she had known. She knew him very well by then. She would have understood what it meant and why he had done it, and she would have taken his hand and said nothing, which was exactly what he would have wanted. The year 1885 found the Bailey Ranch in good condition, and the Bailey family in better. The expanded property was productive. The accounts were sound. Henry was 16 and already conducting himself like someone who will eventually own something worth owning. Clara was 13 and extraordinary with horses in a way that people had stopped being surprised by and had started simply expecting. And James was 4 years old and had recently developed a comprehensive passion for frogs that required constant management from all available adults. David Bailey was 43 years old and in good health, and in possession of a life so much fuller than anything he had allowed himself to imagine at 25 that, when he thought about it directly, It sometimes caught him in the chest with a force that was almost physical. He thought about it on an evening in October of 1885, standing on the porch of the ranch house in the early dark, with the Texas sky above him going through its evening performance. Eudora came and stood beside him and leaned against the porch post and looked at the sky. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He put his arm around her and she settled against his side with the ease of years, and he said, "The upper pasture." She looked up at him. "6 years before I met you," he said, "I used to stand up there on Sunday evenings and look south at the town, and I used to watch your light." "I know," she said. "I was thinking," he said, "about that man, standing up there alone, watching a light he could not explain, not knowing it was going to lead him here." She looked at the dark prairie, at the stars coming on above them one by one, at the particular enormous quiet of a Texas night. "I used to carry that lantern," she said, "because the grief needed somewhere to go. Because the house was full of things that asked me to be capable, and I needed an hour where I could simply be sad without anyone needing me not to be." "I know," he said. "I did not know anyone was watching," she said. "I know that too." She turned her face into his shoulder and he held her, and the October night moved around them with its smell of dry grass and wood smoke from the house, and somewhere inside James was being put to bed by Henry with the particular strained patience of a 16-year-old who has been assigned small sibling management duties and is taking them very seriously. "Are you glad," he asked, "that I spoke to you?" She lifted her face from his shoulder and looked at him with those hazel eyes in the early dark. "David Bailey," she said, with the dry precision that could cut 6 ways and this time cut only one, "you are the finest thing that has ever happened to me, and I think you know it." He smiled. She had a remarkable ability still, after all these years, to produce in him a smile that was entirely unguarded, that had none of the careful self-management that had characterized most of his adult expressions. She had done this from the beginning, from the first real conversation, and he had long since stopped being surprised by it, and had simply come to accept it as one of the permanent conditions of his life. "I know it," he said. She kissed him in the October dark, and the stars continued their business overhead, and the ranch breathed around them in the quiet, steady way of a place that is lived in and loved and cared for, and the lantern hung on its hook inside the front door, ready for Sunday. It would always be ready for Sunday. Some rituals, once begun in love, do not require ending. They simply continue, season after season, faithful and unhurried, carrying their light forward through whatever dark they are given to cross. The widow who had walked to the graveyard with her lantern, and the rancher who had watched her light for a year before he found the courage to speak, had not erased the grief or the loss or the years of solitude that had preceded them. They had simply brought those things into the same life and made room for all of it, the old sorrows and the new joys, and the daily ordinary work of being alive together. And that, on the Texas frontier in the autumn of 1885, with the stars coming on above the Bailey Ranch one by one in their ancient arrangements, was enough. It was, in fact, entirely and completely everything.